Have you ever watched a really good politician answer a question? Oh, especially this election. What's so amazing about a good politician answering a question is a constant coaching reminder to them that your role is to answer the question you wanted asked. Not the question that's actually asked. Your role is to answer the question you want to answer. And so when you watch a good politician, every question relates to what they want to talk about. Every question gets right down to the details of their policy or their plan or what's wrong with Canada or what's wrong happening now, what's wrong with the U.S., How do we swing this question back to, well, we have to make America great again, right? Every question gets spun. Now, that can be a good thing or a bad thing. The good thing about it is you talk about what is important. Actually, Jesus did this a lot. Jesus did this everywhere he went. He would get questions and he would respond with a question, or he would respond with the answer to the question he wanted to answer. Does that make Jesus a bad politician or a good politician? It doesn't matter. What matters is Jesus is driving down or drilling down to the heart of what is important, and that's why he's answering those questions that way. I'm going to try to do that to you next week. How about a lawyer? Have you ever watched a lawyer ask good questions? This may not surprise any of you, but when I was a teenager, we had these teen court. We had teen court available to us. I got a speeding ticket. I went to teen court in exchange for getting a mark on your driver's license or whatever the options were, or something else. And you sit before a jury of your peers, which are teens that have done other things because they require you to serve on jury after you get a ticket also. And then they have a trial about what you've done. And there are these kids that serve volunteer hours as like teen trial lawyers and defense lawyers. And so, of course, I did that because that was exciting and it was fun. And so we did a lot of work onto like, what questions do you ask? How do you ask the questions? And what do you do? A good trial lawyer, you can't lead your witness, right? That's not okay. But you can pose the question in just the right way to elicit the right response. There's a trick there. You can't lead them, but you can shape the answer. Better than that, you can shape how the jury is going to perceive their answer. That's the really tricky one, because then no matter how the person answers it, the jury thinks they're a bad person, or if you're a defense, a good person, whatever you want to do. Just in case, if you're wondering, the most interesting one I did was like a 15-year-old that stole some action figures, and here's a bunch of other teens that had stolen bigger things sitting on his trial, on his jury, and they gave him like the maximum sentence for like $10 of action figures because he was 15 years old and he stole action figures. There's only so much you can do with that from a defense standpoint. But questions are pivotal in how we live out our society and how we do things and where we go and how we think about our life. Right now, we're asking questions about climate change. Here in Maple Ridge, we are constantly asking questions about homelessness. We are asking questions about how is the best approach to make a great community or to serve your community? What is the best way to address our faith? Or how do we make our faith real in a time with so much turmoil around us? Questions shape everything that we do. Jesus' ministry was a lot like a good trial lawyer. or a good politician. In fact, there's one of my favorite books, if you want something great to read. Nathan's reading it right now, called Politics of Jesus. Phenomenal. Way over all our heads. That's fine. You'll pick up some stuff and not others, but it's awesome. John Howard Yoder. But Jesus constantly was driving questions for people to get them to respond in a different way, to get them to think about what they were doing and where they were going and why they were living their faith. And I think that's the significant one that we are trying to do here, is how do we ask questions in a way that digs deeper into what we're doing with our faith, with our life, with everything. So Jesus asked these questions. He asked, who do you say that I am? Now, typically you would expect a teacher to tell you who they are, but he's willing to ask the question and let them think through the answer. Who do you say that I am? Do you love me? He asked. Which of you is without sin? He asked. We looked through that last week. Everywhere that Jesus went, he was asking these deep, penetrating questions and eliciting responses that made somebody think about their faith. Now, here's what's interesting. We don't like questions. We like answers. It makes us feel good and gooey inside when we have an answer to a hard question or when we have an answer to an easy question. So what that means is we ask easy questions so that we have easy answers. It makes life really boring. It makes faith really boring. It makes our journey a little bit pointless, which is what Jesus was trying to get us to rethink through. So throughout history, the church has been asking questions. We can't not do it. Right now, the church is asking questions about politics. 60 years ago, church in North America avoided politics like the plague. Right now, we're asking questions about what a church is supposed to do or be. So we're building boundaries and borders to try to make this insider and outsider more clearly defined. Throughout history, we've been asking questions and trying to answer them, and we've walled ourselves off at each step along the way. First question, first century, what do we do with the Jews and the Christians? Very simple, right? Are we Jewish? Are we Christian? We see Paul answering these questions in his letters. Somebody's asking, does somebody have to be circumcised? Kids are gone. Somebody have to be circumcised to be a Christian? Is this part of the process? Do they have to be a Jew and then a Christian? What does that look like? Well, can they eat? Do they have to eat kosher meat? What is the process here? What about these Greeks that have been eating meat straight off the sacrificial plate for decades, and now you're going to tell them that that's not okay and that they have to find their meat somewhere else? Like, what does it mean to be Jewish or Christian in the first century? We continue that process, and one of the next questions that gets asked in the second century is, this is a good one, what is a heretic? Two quick stories on heretics. I sat down with a guy once who wanted to know about my theology. Well, that's probably inaccurate. He wanted to know how to counteract my theology. We should say that way. And so we sat down together, and he said this to me because he wants to ask me questions. He said, "Are you ready for your Inquisition?" And I laughed because I thought he was joking. But I don't think he was, looking back on that. I don't think he was. I think he thought I was a heretic, and he was the one that gets to decide what a heretic is. Well, 1,800 years ago, we settled that question as a church. You know what a heretic is? It's somebody that doesn't listen to the bishop. Somebody who doesn't listen to the priest. Maybe now we could stretch that. Somebody that doesn't listen to the pastor. I guess he's the heretic in that story. I'm not naming anyone heretics. Calm down. I'm just saying, that early question is, what is a heretic? Led us to an answer that said, essentially, apostolic tradition. That is, somebody that was given the bishop's role from one of the apostles of Jesus is who decides whether you're in or out, right or wrong, and down to statements that someone who does not listen to their bishop is then a heretic. What's really sad about that story is that along the way, we lost some really great thinkers. We lost some really great, faithful Christians trying to determine what faith was in their day. But once they got labeled by the church as one not listening to their bishop, they were cast out. One guy had donated $200,000, something, whatever it was in his day, to the church. 5 years later, they said, you know what? We don't want your donation. You get out and take your $200,000 with you. That's how strong of an opinion we had about our apostolic tradition and what made a heretic. Every century, we have these monster questions about what is the church and what are we doing and where are we going and what is the purpose. And most of the time, we are shutting down questions left and right. So the question itself, what is a heretic, leads us to block people out, to stop questions before they're asked. Next, we ask about church and state. We ask about icons. We ask about Islam. We ask Islam and then icons. You guys familiar with the story of the icons? So we had an East and West church. Icons, that is like Jesus up front, or a symbol of, or a depiction of an apostle or a disciple or Mother Mary, split the church in half. Icons. Now, we don't have anything in here because we're on the other half of that split. But it seems so silly to think about having icons as being such a theological issue that we cut our church in half. And beyond that, I don't want to get too political in this story, but beyond that, we watched the Eastern Church get overwhelmed by Islam traitors. And this isn't... There's no way to finish this nicely. But we watched the church dwindle because there was no support from the Western church. Let's put it that way. That's nice. We watched this occur because we couldn't get past one church having icons and another not. Later on, we ask about reason. We ask about evolution in the 19th century. We ask about colonialism in the 18th century and who gets to be in charge of people that you conquer. These are questions that the church has been asking, and at every point we have walled ourselves off from questions with easy answers that wipe the floor clean. Jesus consistently asks us to dig beyond these differences, to dig into the heart of our faith. So you know this story pretty well because I regurgitate it often. But here's the deal. Jesus walked into a system that was being taught and being led down to the details. This is how you're supposed to live out your faith. This is what it's supposed to be. This is why. And Jesus followed in the prophetic tradition to call people back to the place that they belong, to say, your role is to care for the other. Your role is to speak truth into a world that is marginalizing and oppressing people everywhere you look. That's what Jesus called people to. That's what the prophets called people to. In fact, everywhere we look, you can go back to the laws, you can look in the prophets, you can look in the kings, you can look anywhere, and you will see God speaking through people and getting them to dig down to the heart of caring for people. Most often, oppressed people. So when Jesus asks a good question, He asks you to think about what you're doing. Let's look real quick at Matthew 16. We won't spend a lot of time here, but a little bit. We're going to start in verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, He asked His disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" This is His way of referring to Himself. "Who do people say that I am?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." That's how I'm going to answer your questions next week. Some people like this, some people like that. And He said to them, But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." You see, Jesus is drilling down to the question to say, but what about you? What do you think of me? Who do you think that I am? And everywhere He goes, He calls people to think beyond the question. And so someone asks Him, "What do I have to do to be saved?" Have you asked this question? Because our church likes to tell us this answer regardless of what question we ask. What do I have to do to be saved? And He says, "Oh, no problem. Give everything away." And the guy goes away sad. He goes away heartbroken. Because Jesus has called him to something bigger, to something deeper, to some depth that he cannot discover. At another point, they ask him, "What is the greatest commandment?" Constantly asking questions. And He gives them two. And they are old, and they are solid, and they are renewed in His response. Love the Lord your God with all you have, and love your neighbor. It is as old as any Jewish statement about what you're supposed to do. And He gave them the exact response that they were supposed to hear. And yet, He renewed the call in the same sentence by love your neighbor, and He expanded that into a place of your enemies, your friends, your neighbors, your family, your community, everywhere you go. He says, dig, 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 and discover. So it's time for us to stop squashing the questions. When we were having our Inquisitions, not mine, but as a church, not Open Door, I should clarify. When we were having our Inquisitions, we were asking to dig into, okay, do you agree with me or not? Do you have questions that I can't answer? And if you do, I'm going to squash those. We're going to literally burn you at the stake, and we're going to move on with our own statement about who God is and what we're supposed to do. It's time for us to stop squashing the questions. I would like to say that we've gotten better at that. Every few decades or 100 years, we ask new questions and we get reformers and we get new thinkers, and we get people that are changing the way we think about church and about faith, but we squash them at the same time. And it's time for us to ask those questions openly and honestly and dig into the heart of them. So next week, who's filled out a question? We got 1. Do I have more? 2. All right. We got 2 questions. 3 questions. So next week, we're going to ask the question, but we're also going to dig into why that question is important and what makes that question thrive in our faith and our purpose in our life. So we can ask questions about the dinosaurs, but I'm going to answer the question I want to answer, which is what matters about that question, right? And how do we live into those questions and that faith and that life that breathes and lives and moves and cares for people? That's what matters. So that's all I've got today. At the heart of everything, Jesus is digging into what matters. And when he answers a question, he answers it with something ambiguous. And then he expands it into something deeper. And then he gives you a purpose to carry that message and to carry that question into the lives of others. So today we ask questions about climate change. And here in Canada, we're pretty mellow on our response. But church, Christians, south of our border, don't answer that question nicely and don't think deeply about how it impacts faith and God's creation. We're pushing that away with a 10-ton brick or something like that. We're asking questions about how we live in our community. And what we like to say, what we like to answer is, well, you're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world. You're supposed to be separate. You're supposed to be the church. But the reality is we can't do God's work if we're separated. We can't do God's work if we see ourselves over and above any other individual. Jesus is constantly asking us to think about those questions.